name is Debashree Mukherjee, and I am a historian of media and a film scholar. I teach in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University in New York.
Good morning. My name is Keithley Woolward, and I'm trained in literature, French and Francophone literatures and cultural studies. And I'm currently responsible for the Master's in History and Literature that is offered here at the Global Center in Paris.
So, hello, Keithley.
So I suppose part of the conversation that we're having is about intersections between the work that we do.
Mm-hmm.
So the program History and Literature takes a sort of very broad look at what we consider literature, what we consider history,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps the importance of archives in that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And you're currently doing some work that's turning around this question
Mm-hmm.
of archives.
Mm-hmm. I mean, because you mentioned the history and literature program, which I think is such a fascinating kind of coupling, right?
Mhm.
Because often history with a capital H is considered so different from the cultural, the literary. And I think so much of the work that I'm currently doing arises from this understanding of how important are certain cultural forms to certain major understandings of historical events.
Okay.
So I'm currently working on this project on a media history of indentured labor migration from South Asia to certain what were called sugar islands, sugar colonies, which you're very well acquainted with. I'm specifically looking at Mauritius, Fiji, and a lot of that interest started with this letter that I'd found when I was working on my previous book, which was on film history of 1930s Bollywood, Bombay cinema. And there was this letter from this man from South Africa to a film actress in Bombay in 1942, in which he says, I'd love your films, but I wanted to just gently maybe rebuke you that you're using this term in your films, which we are waging a major kind of discursive battle against. And that word was coolie.
Right.
And it was very interesting to me both that this woman in the 1940s in India, where the anti-coolie, anti-indenture movement had been going on from the 1910s, was A, ignorant of this entire discourse, and B, that this man in South Africa thought that cinema was an important site for having this kind of discursive battle and the battle over representation.
Right, of course.
Which is something we all understand today. But it seemed very striking for the 1940s. So just to say that the relationship between history and culture as an important terrain for thinking about contestations that are political has been very, very interesting for me.
Yeah, but I mean, there's also that extended question of representation, how narratives are constructed, both as historical phenomena as well as literary phenomena. Cinema being one way of narrativizing certain kinds of historical events and experiences.
Exactly. And I think of so many of these indentured diasporic populations. So where the indenture system starts in the era of emancipation, so post-British abolition of plantation slavery. So it's an 1830s onwards phenomenon that these South Asian workers are being transported to replace cheaply the formerly enslaved, newly emancipated African workers. So while many go to the cultural, the literary, the aesthetic, the cinematic, in order to understand certain historical events, epochs, or as a site of the documentation of certain things that may not have been documented visually,
Right.
a lot of the diasporas of indenture scattered across the globe went back to Indian cinema as a way to connect with this imagined homeland that they hadn't been to or might never go to over 2 or 3 generations. So there was a lot of craving to see films with people speaking and singing in the languages that they identified with, while they were in this foreign land as foreign workers. So cinema is also an affective space to create a sense of belonging and community. So these are not Hollywood films, these are not French films. These are films being made in India in various Indian languages. By the 30s, we have the talkies. So it's also a place where people are hearing the rich, idiomatic kind of diversity of these places that they'd only heard of from their grandparents.
Right. So history is also about affect and the affective, right? So so these images actually allowed for, even if one was not going to be able to go back to that home space, to connect in some way to a space that we know is present, but that we may not have access to.
No, exactly. So it's, and I think the way you're talking about space, I think cinema is also a very spatial form, right? So cinema can literally transport you to other places, which is why so much of the work I've been doing in archives in Paris right now have been part of this very early kind of impetus in the cinematic form of using cinema as a form of travel. So touristic films tied very closely with ideas of imperial conquest really were one of the kind of earliest generic forms for film from the 1910s onwards. So a lot of the images and films I've been able to access here were made by French merchants who were visiting certain colonies and happened to document through their personal camera some images of Martinique, Réunion, Mauritius, but also a camera person sent by the Ministry of Agriculture and others. So it's a way in which cinema can bring through these captured images all these different geographical spaces into an imagination of what is the French Imperium. So that spatial kind of work really is very, very critical to what cinema has been mobilized into doing since its inception.
Great. Actually, I want to take off this point that you just mentioned, looking at films in archives here in France. We started the conversation in terms of the migration of indentured labor from India to other parts of the world. There's an idea of thinking only along former colonial master lines where India, so it would have been in the English-speaking Caribbean or other places, but what this shows is that there is also a presence in French-speaking, therefore former French colonies as well.
Yeah. Definitely. So I've visited a few archives during my short research visit this time, and it's really remarkable how little these archives have been explored by scholars based in the US on one hand, film scholars, and scholars of Indian history on the other hand, based across the world. And part of it is because India was colonized by the British. So much of the post-colonial historiographic kind of impulses have been to locate all the histories between the metropole and the colony. So all the research takes place between London and New Delhi.
Right.
And so it's the British Library and those India Office records that are often kind of looked at, or films in the BFI and elsewhere. Whereas I started to discover that the French colonial and British colonial connections happen along two very important kind of axes. So one, because some places I'm looking at were doubly colonized or triply colonized. So for example, Mauritius was first conquered by the Dutch, then it was settled by the French, and then it was taken over by the British. So Mauritius is a place where people speak in English, Creole, French till today. And French is still a very, very important lingua franca. And it's these different moments of conquest that overlap in all these interesting ways. So Mauritius and that East African kind of Indian Ocean region with Madagascar, Réunion, Chagos, it's a very francophone kind of an history. So it's important, while my colonial records for that time period, the 18th, 19th century, are located at the British Library in London. A lot of my more popular, mainstream, vernacular kinds of sources are in French or Mauritian French Creole. So that's a very interesting story. But the other interesting part of indenture is that though this entire migration is orchestrated and managed by the British, who are the ruling kind of colonial force in South Asia at the time, they are cooperating in this very trans-imperial way with other kinds of imperial entities. So the French are actually petitioning the British, saying, can you send some of those South Asian workers for our French plantations?
Fascinating.
So there's a lot of renting out of these workers. And hence the French story is a very important part of the story, which I have not seen people really remark upon.
Well, it's fascinating actually. There's the case of Mauritius is an interesting one, but if we look at the Caribbean region, for example, the sort of last great sort of left socialist revolution was the Maurice Bishop revolution in Grenada. And while in a similar way, Grenada at the point of its independence was a British colony, until roughly the 1870s, it was a French possession. So much of the archives around understanding Grenada, if we're looking for sort of a rootedness of revolutionary fervor there, would require actually having to go through French archives to understand how that those movements develop. So there's a gap as well, even in sort of reconstructing Caribbean historiography, because at the end, at independence, if they were British, then the assumption is that the archives must be British, without looking at the sort of long history. Where you may have to go through multiple languages, multiple countries in order to be able to have access to information.
No, and I think that's also a very interesting kind of a media history, right? Because in the sense that empires don't just suddenly rise and fall, there's a lot of continuities and overlaps. And empires need basic media infrastructures for governance. And often those media infrastructures, I mean, what language is the language of power? What are the scribes and writing in? What is the language of the courtrooms and the legal petitions? So, for example, the British, for a long time in South Asia, used Persian because they were taking on the previous language of power for a lot of, till they phased it out and instituted English as the official language. Similarly, if I look at documents in Mauritius, as I did a few years ago, about British indenture, a lot of the language being used by the clerks and the authorities is French. Even into the moment of British colonization. So these languages, because these systems are much more entrenched than the coming and going of systems of power. There's an entire network of writing and correspondence, and
that's fascinating. It makes it very clear that there's a network of how power is constructed and maintained, and it's not in isolation. There might be different places or nodes within this network, but it's colonial power writ large maintains itself through these networks and sort of exchanges. Fascinating.
And techniques,
right? Of course.
The language of governance, the language of administration, the language all down the chain, right? From the district commissioner to the superintendent of the police to a lowly clerk who knows one language and he can't quickly switch to English overnight. So those are, and it's very important then for the researcher to be nimble. I mean, my French is really not great. But if I were to persevere with these kinds of government records, it would be necessary for me to be able to move swiftly across these languages.
Of course. So tell me a little bit about what you found in the archives in the time that you've been here.
I have found a lot of agricultural films as a genre. So these are non-fiction documentary films. And I found two sets. So one set made in the 1910s and another set made in the 1930s. These are very dry films. Your students would call them outright boring. I know more about growing, harvesting, cutting, processing sugarcane than I think anyone needs to know as a layperson. So I've watched a bunch of films that are about, so because sugar and sugarcane is the main driving material for my project.
Of course, okay.
Because a lot of the migrations I'm looking at was very specifically for sugar plantations, which was the reigning commodity of the British plantation economy in the 19th century. So sugar was really the engine driving a lot of this transportation of labor, this kind of colonial capitalist economy. And hence I've been looking very specifically for sugarcane films. So the films I found were made by two, again, very interesting entities. One was the Pathé Film Company, one of the oldest, I think, after Gaumont, French film production and distribution and exhibition firms, still very prominent. You can watch a Pathé film near you at any evening, on any evening. And the other institution that was making these agricultural films was the French Ministry of Agriculture.
Right.
Now, it would seem that this private corporate entity and the governmental entity would have very different kinds of aims, but those aims tend to coalesce in certain ideological ways.
Right.
Though, of course, the Ministry of Agriculture was making films that were not for any commercial gain. They were meant as propaganda, as education, as the betterment, improvement discourses, right, about modernizing French agriculture through these different kinds of films. And the Pathé films were more touristic. Let's travel to an exotic place and see another example of French industry flourishing and actually bettering another place.
Okay.
So an excuse to go into the tropics and shoot lots of palm trees and have some element of color, very literally, through images of the workers on the plantations, but addressed to a more casual audience who wants to see travel films.
Right.
But this excuse of taking to this industrial space
So
of the plantation.
There's sort of like an undercurrent of, even in these spaces that could be for leisure, there is a sort of forward march of progress that is following you as the person coming into these spaces that's there as well. And so perhaps one can feel as though my being here is good because look at what we have brought.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that these are not marked as spaces of leisure. These are marked as spaces of the plantation industry, right? Okay. But the films create these narratives of saying, but look, these are also beautiful places. Okay. And look at how the French settler, plantation owner is living. So there'll always be shots of the big colonial mansion. Okay. And then there'll be some shots of the beautiful gardens. The British version of these films often show shots of tennis being played, folks having cocktails in the evening, to also encourage more French from the mainland or British from the mainland to go and do that important patriotic work of settling another place.
Okay.
And this has been a famous kind of a narrative from the 17th century onwards, that the life in the colony is much better. You could be lower middle class person in France, but you will be living like a king in Martinique.
And having access to spaces that you probably would not necessarily...
Right. Okay. And like in South Asia, one of the biggest narratives to seduce people into coming and working there for the government was, you'll have access to cheap staff.
Right.
Anyone could have 17 servants in India who would do anything from pulling fans with their hands, because we know that the tropics are notoriously hot.
Of course.
So these films are doing a lot of that work visually. Sometimes it's in your face. Sometimes through the repetition, it just starts to emerge that there is this very direct kind of propagandistic work that's happening across the private film companies and the government studios.
And
It's been fascinating.
wow. And so these archives have just not been explored at all necessarily.
So I'm not very abreast with the literature in the scholarship in the French language about these archives. But for example, these films get shown across France at different documentary and non-fiction film festivals. There are PhDs being written at the Sorbonne and elsewhere about some of this work. But I have not seen them discussed in English language scholarship, where right now in the film scholarship world, there is a kind of a explosion of interest in non-fiction film, and particularly what are called industrial films, which some people are also now scholars are calling useful films. Films that are meant to directly have some use, pedagogical use, training use. So in that world of the useful film, I haven't seen these exact films being discussed. But that's also because I'm looking at a very niche kind of intersection. So it's not just agricultural films, but it's also films that feature certain kinds of laboring forces, entities that are both Afro Mauritian, and also South Asian. So the coming together of those two things is, I don't know anyone else who's really doing that. So I don't blame anyone
No, of course,
for not having gone there.
Of course. Well, sort of on a related note, in terms of archives being unexplored, one of the things for me in my work is thinking through questions of Haiti as an important sort of touchstone in Caribbean and New World studies around the revolutionary fervor that would have created the first Black nation to liberate itself from the shackles of slavery. And there's a lot of work that's been done about the sort of indemnity that Haiti was forced, and I put that in quotation marks because it's a very nuanced conversation, to pay to France in terms of restitution. One of the fascinating things is that there are a number of archives here, Ministry of Finance archives, for example, or even National Assembly archives, where extensive discussions around how this came to be have yet to also be explored. So there's the value of just spending time in archives and sort of exploring is quite useful.
No, exactly. And I often tell students that, the spending of the time and that patience is very important, because often the questions, for me, the research questions have to arise from the archive.
Absolutely.
I can't have a kind of preconceived idea of this is what I want to find and then go just looking for that. A lot of surprises take place in the archive. A lot of disappointments happen in the archive. But I think, so just these 2 weeks here in Paris for me have really shifted some of the ways in which I was thinking about what it is I'm studying and how I
Has there been a surprise?
I think I was not expecting to find so many extant films from that period. I'm used to working on a time period in which we generally accept that films are lost. So I will find documentation about films that were made, but I may never find the corresponding print. So in this case, I've actually found extant surviving prints in impeccable condition, and that really changes the entire way of thinking about that film archive, because one can know from a synopsis what the story or the subject of a film is. But until you watch it, you don't understand what was the visual, aesthetic imagination in framing that subject, in presenting that subject. The films I watched, the Ministry of Agriculture films, are kind of overwhelmingly picturesque. So shot in this picturesque tradition of landscape painting. I was not ready for that because I'd seen that I study obviously a lot of the visual genealogies of landscape painting as they enter into still photography. Um, and the Pathé films don't have that aesthetic. But the Ministry of Agriculture films have this very clear aesthetic of the picturesque, and they shoot landscape in Réunion, in Martinique, in this very, very kind of formulaic way of what a pretty picture of the non-urban looks like. So there's always a palm tree that's framing on the foreground of the right of the frame. There's always rolling hills in the background. Often these wide shots, the landscape is just laid out in front of you, available for you. And a lot of the ways in which one thinks of the politics of the gaze, right? You're looking at something, its availability to you. In that visual sense, also kind of undergirding an idea of this is yours, this land is French. And those things I would not have really been able to feel in this visceral way unless I'd seen the film.
Right, of course.
So that's been quite something. I'll have to really sit with it for a while.
Okay. What are the next steps then in terms of where you go with this? You're going to be seeing the archives, you're going to be seeing more films, spending some time sort of getting a sense of the narration, the framing, the constructions, etc. Where does this potentially take you?
So there's just so much to do. And this could be a never-ending project,
of course,
as you know, right? It could take so many directions. I have a few temporal limits that I've set to the project, at least in its current iteration. So I think the next thing for me is I want to write up a little bit, which might become a chapter of the book, on the relation of the plantation and a media history of the plantation as a visual history. Till I got to Paris, my main object of interest was the stereoscopic card, because I'd found a lot of stereographs in the US and British context of colonial plantations. And I had given up on the film part of the story. But so now it will end with tracing this move from landscape painting to still photography to the stereoscope to film. I don't know if I can do that in one chapter, but it'll be fun. It'll be fun to try to muddle through it.
Of course. And maybe just sort of a side thought. We had talked about how the island of Mauritius has been constructed in these really fascinating ways. Inspiration for, the very famous Paul and Virginie narrative from the Enlightenment period about thinking through landscape, tropical spaces, etc. That's still very present.
It is, and that is the project that I had come to Paris to really pursue. It's moved a little bit off to one side, but it's amazing how, and this is part of the Anglophone, Francophone scholarship kind of divide. I was completely struck when I discovered that this story of Paul et Virginie had circulated so much. It was one of the most best-selling early print works of the 18th century, traveled far and wide, got translated into Bengali, went to India, and I had never heard of it. And for me, the production of an imagination of the island, the deserted island, the tropical island, was always associated with these other works like Robinson Crusoe and so on, which are often cited in any big anthropological, historical, philosophical work about the production of ideas of islandness, tropicality. And then I come to Paris and I say Paul et Virginie to someone and they go like, really? Because every person has studied it in school.
Absolutely.
It's
one of those foundational texts of 18th century literature. Just you have to go through.
Everyone's tired of it, and they're like, "I can't believe you're interested in this." But it again points to that very interesting way in which why is it that certain texts. Even though both these texts traveled as widely, there were films being made about Paul et Virginie in New York in the 1910s, silent films obviously shot in the neighborhood. And yet in the scholarship and in the most dominant scholarship, right, where then these citations get perpetuated, one doesn't see that kind of intermingling of these two story strands. So yes, so obviously Polly Virginie, very, very important. It actually came up in the films as well. So I've been thinking about Polly Virginie as setting this template for what is a tropical paradise, right? Because you know the story. And it gets referenced in a lot of contemporaneous texts at the time. Rousseau will cite it. Darwin was apparently very fascinated by it. In this age of exploration and this age of the emergence of a lot of scientific kind of disciplines. But then I watch a 1930s film by the Ministry of Agriculture shot in Martinique. And one of the title cards says, "No doubt you will recognize or identify this scene with scenes from Polly Virginie."
So it's sort of, it's almost a kind of symbolic element through which to
and
connect.
A very portable kind of an idea of what the tropics are. And that could be very easily Martinique, it could be Mauritius, it could be Fiji, it could be so many other places. Exactly. So Polly Virginie really has this very oversized spectral role in informing this imagination.
And it was the island of Mauritius that was the sort of inspiration for.
So it is set in the Ile de France, in Mauritius. Yeah, so it's a book that's based on Mauritius, but very quickly it doesn't have to be Mauritius in its specificity anymore. It could be any place. And those kinds of ways in which one can easily substitute one place for another, the tropics start to coalesce into this one big hot steaming cauldron of luxurious foliage and disease at the same time. Right?
But also the sort of desires are there as well, you know, that are just almost always under the surface as well. I mean, the steaminess sort of is a certain kind of lasciviousness that's there too.
Of course, and I think that also, if one does a history of like popular visual culture, they again show, you see all the interconnections. Because if you look at travel posters to these places, you know, travel posters issued by steamship companies, they're again playing into the same tropes. It's hot, but you could be sitting on this beach being served by a local waiter, this tall, cool drink. So don't worry, get on that ship, get to the beach, you'll be fine.
Fascinating. I mean, what's exciting for me, again, because I'm, you know, responsible for a program that looks at literature and history. Here you have a major literary text informing historic constructions of ideas around the tropics and the sort of back and forth between those spaces that are distant as well as the metropole.
No, exactly. And this is why I keep going back to that early exchange, right, between this man in South Africa and this actress in Bombay. It's very important that he is able to help us see that the links between the actual political battles being waged at the time by overseas Indians were about political representation, a fight for equal franchise in these new places that were now their home. But that political representation, legal representation, is really intertwined with the kind of cinematic discursive representations which really consolidate ideas of race, ideas of ethnicity, ideas of hierarchy, difference, cultural identity. And so it's very important to keep those things in conversation, because people intuitively knew that these were all important fronts for fighting the anti-racist, anti-colonial battle. And we keep forgetting.
Right. Well, we've actually connected the dots.
Thank you. Thanks for this conversation.